This is a lecture for week 1, Introduction to the Old Testament. In this lecture, I want to do just a brief overview of the books of the Old Testament, their order in English Bibles and Hebrew Bibles, and a review of the timeline for the events of the Old Testament. Since it may have been a little while since you have taken a different Old Testament class, OT 500 or something like that, I thought it might be a good idea just to do a brief overview, and especially of the timeline, which is helpful to have in the back of your mind when you're reading about the dating of different books and Psalms and things like that. The first chart you see here is the chart of the books of the Old Testament as they appear in their order in English Bibles. You have the history books first, with wisdom and poetry in the middle and prophecy at the end. The Pentateuch consists of the first 5 books, with the historical books following in general chronological order according to the events in the books. It's important to note that the events, the dating of the events is different from the dating of when the book was written. Those are 2 separate issues. The prophets consist of major prophets, which are longer, more substantial, and then the minor prophets, which are shorter books and called minor because of their length. Lamentations is not really very long, but gets placed next to Jeremiah by tradition that Jeremiah was the author, although that's an unsure, just some a tradition that he was the author of that. The way that the books are ordered in English Bibles comes from the order that they are found in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. The Septuagint is usually abbreviated LXX, and you'll come across this abbreviation a lot in discussions of commentaries when they're looking at textual variants. Sometimes the Septuagint and the Greek has a word that's a little different, or a variant that changes the meaning of a verse. And so commentators will sometimes have a discussion about this. Later, when Jerome, the church father, came along, he produced the Latin Vulgate, and he followed the order of books that is found in the Septuagint. If you look at the next chart here, the Hebrew Bible has books in a different order and a smaller number of books, and that's because several of the books are combined together. The section of law or Torah is the same as in English Bibles. The prophets have included here former prophets and latter, and so former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, are usually in English Bibles in the historical section, but are considered prophets and put in this section in Hebrew Bibles, which begs the question about genre when you're working in these books and just thinking about the issue of history and history writing and historiography and what kind of books they are. Are they primarily history books, or are they primarily prophetic books? So it changes your expectation of a book to know what kind of genre it is. The Book of the 12 is considered one book. And so when I say at the top that there's only 8 prophets, that's because Book of the 12 are all combined together and counted as one. At the top, you'll see that sometimes the Hebrew Bible is called a Tanakh, and that's an acronym where T stands for Torah, the Hebrew word for law. A better and maybe more insightful translation, or helpful translation, especially as we go into the book of Psalms, is that Torah can also mean instruction. So it's not as narrow as just law. It includes all the stories and narratives about God's instruction for Israel, as well as the actual law code itself. The N in Tanakh stands for Nevi'im, which is the Hebrew word for prophets. K for Ketuvim, the Hebrew word for writings. In the third section of writings, you'll see the list here starting with Psalms. However, sometimes different manuscripts will have this section of books in a different order with Ruth in front of Psalms. And there's thinking there that sometimes Ruth may have been placed at the beginning because the last chapter in Ruth discusses the genealogy of David. And then many of the Psalms are entitled Psalm of David. And so that there may have been a connection there in an attempt to link those books together. Within the section of the writings, or Ketuvim, there are subcategories: the poetic books, Psalm, Job, and Proverbs. And then you have the 5 scrolls, or the Megillot. These are books that are linked together because they are used in association with some of the festivals in the Old Testament. So, for example, Ruth is associated with Pentecost, or celebration of the harvest. Song of Songs is traditionally associated with Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And this view takes the Song of Songs as an allegory between God and Israel and their relationship. Lamentations commemorates the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple when King Nebuchadnezzar came in and King of Babylon sacked Jerusalem in 586 BC. Ecclesiastes is associated with the Feast of Tabernacles and the celebration of life and eating and drinking and being merry. And then Esther celebrates Purim, the failure of the plot to destroy the Jews by Haman in Persia. The last section of the writings are the historical books, Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, which is linked. Those are linked together as one book, and then Chronicles is one book. Now, historical put in quote marks because, of course, Daniel is probably not primarily history, but more categorized as wisdom and apocalyptic literature. So that's a very generalized label there. Whenever I teach a class on the Old Testament, I always go back to the timeline of Old Testament events. I've found that this is a helpful framework when you're working in the Old Testament to be able to associate a book or a person or an event with a time period so that you have a general idea of the order of events and when something may or may not have happened. So this is just a simplistic way of just keeping things straight in your mind, but it's quite helpful, I've found. So the section of beginnings, starting with creation in Genesis, and basically covers the period of time or the events that are covered in the Pentateuch, all the way to the end of Deuteronomy when Moses dies and Joshua takes over the leadership around 1250. Now, that date is a disputed date. Some timelines and scholars will place that date earlier, and it depends on when you date the Exodus from Egypt, which is a separate issue from this class. The settlement period begins in the story of the Old Testament when Joshua takes over leadership. The Israelites cross the Jordan River and go into the land. And then you have, during this time period, the events in the books of Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, down to about 1050 BC. And again, let me make the note that this is covering the events in the books, but not the actual dating of when the books were written, because that probably happened much later and is a separate issue from just trying to identify when people lived and that kind of thing. The next major section is the period of the kings, starting with King Saul, who was crowned in 1 Samuel, and going through all the way through the books of Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, down to 586 BC, when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came in and crushed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and took many of the Jews back to exile in Babylon. The period of exile lasts until 539 BC. And if you remember, 539 marks the date when Cyrus the Great, who was the Persian commander, comes in and takes over, conquers the Babylonian kingdom and takes over, and the Persian Empire is settled into Babylon. And at that point, King Cyrus allows the Jews to return back to Jerusalem. And so this decree is recorded at the end of 2nd Chronicles, also the beginning of Ezra. And the books of Ezra and Nehemiah then record some of the events that took place when some of the Jews returned and started rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple. The post-exilic period then extends down from 539 on. The date 400 is kind of a random date there. The next major event would have been probably in 333 or so, when the Greek commander Alexander the Great comes in and they conquer, his army conquers the Persian Empire and the Greeks take over. So it's nice to have this framework in your mind. With the book of Psalms, as we go through Psalms, you'll find that it's a little bit murky trying to date when some of the Psalms were written or the events in the Psalms. We'll do a little bit of discussion. You'll do some reading about some of the titles in the Psalms and whether those are original or perhaps edited in later and contain traditions about the Psalms. But there aren't a lot of Psalms that have actual mentions of people or dates that we can date them specifically. But sometimes you can tell if a psalm has something to do with the exile and the grief and loss. For example, Psalm 137 is very clearly associated with the grief of being in Babylon and that Jerusalem's destroyed. So it's important to have this in mind and just keep the timeline there as you think about dating of certain things. This is a more specific timeline here, which divides the period of the kings into the United Kingdom, which marks the reigns of King Saul, King David, and Solomon. 930 is when Solomon died, and his son Rehoboam took the throne in Jerusalem, and he was an unwise ruler and listened to his young counselors. And you can read the story in 1 Kings chapter 12. And they decided and they urged him to raise taxes to show what a powerful person he was. And so he went ahead and did it, but caused some rebellion in the north. And so Jeroboam, who's normally known as Jeroboam the First, took over and separated from Judah. And you have then from that time forward a divided kingdom started by Jeroboam in the north, the kingdom of Israel, Judah in the south, reigned by Rehoboam. And Israel lasted till 722, when the king of Assyria comes in and takes captive many of the people in the north, and that's the end of the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom, if you read through the prophets and the book of First and Second Kings, is filled with accounts of their unfaithfulness to Yahweh, and each of the kings is measured back to Jeroboam the First and called wicked. In the south, all of the kings in the south are part of the Davidic line and related to David and reigning in Jerusalem. And we'll talk later in the quarter about some of the messianic prophecies that are associated with the kings in Jerusalem in the south. Then you see here the final periods of exile and post-exile. Finally, I've added just a couple maps for you to take a look at. The first map shows the divided kingdom with Israel in the north in the green, Judah in the south with the purple. The Judean kings in the south reigned in Jerusalem. And those are the ones who were related to David. The north, the capital city, was Samaria, and that was sacked in 722 BC by the Assyrians. The final map shows a larger view of the route the exiles were taken when they were taken to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. So take a minute and get familiar and review the maps and the area, and have this in the back of your mind as you're reading parts of the Psalms and place names that may be associated with them. It's always helpful also to have maps available if you have a study Bible or something like that, so that you can look up places that may be mentioned in some of your reading. That's all for this first lecture, and always feel free to email me with questions or put a question into the questions forum if you'd like to know about any topic that I may have mentioned here and didn't quite explain fully enough.